Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Filion and you can find me as Pixel Princess on the Sketchy app. Today we're going to be talking about and covering watercolor and ink techniques. We are going to be experimenting with how to recreate real watercolor techniques such as wet on dry, dry on dry, dry on wet, and wet on wet while using the digital tools that we find in Procreate. We're also going to be experimenting with inking techniques and masking techniques. We're going to be creating some hatching using ink as well as learning how to add unexpected abstract elements to our work. So let's get started. Hi guys, for this lesson I thought we would do something a little bit different and a little bit of fun. We're going to go back and forth between using traditional watercolor techniques and then creating them digitally on the iPad. So what I've done first of all is I've taken a piece of watercolor paper and I've just kind of labeled 4 boxes on it of the 4 main techniques we're going to be trying out today. So wet on dry, dry on dry, dry on wet, and wet on wet. And we're going to talk about what those mean and then how to translate them digitally onto the iPad. So I've taken a picture of this piece of paper and you can see it here in my camera roll. So I'm just going to quickly edit that down for you guys. And we're going to bring it into the iPad. And this is also good practice on how to bring in backgrounds for your iPad as well. So I've cropped that down in my photo library, and then in Procreate, I'm simply going to click on the wrench tool and I'm going to select Image, Insert a Photo, and then choose that image that I just manipulated it and add it to my camera. And now I actually have a nice watercolor paper background onto my canvas. And of course, in this case, I've got the white bars on it, but we're not going to worry about that for now. So to start out, I have my nice little travel watercolor kit, and I'm going to show you guys how we're going to create it using traditional watercolor, so these 4 techniques, and then how we're going to translate that digitally. Don't worry if you don't have a watercolor set, you don't need it for this lesson. This is just to show you guys the difference between the traditional media and the digital media. So to start with, we're going to do a wet on dry technique. Whenever you see the words on something, on dry or on wet, that's referring to the actual paper itself. So on dry is meaning that our paper is dry, which is pretty standard for any kind of medium. And so wet on dry is kind of your traditional watercolor or any kind of painting technique where what you're going to do is you're going to wet your brush full of a nice pigment, and then on dry paper, you're simply going to place it down, right? So this is just kind of your standard painting technique, simple. Now, dry on dry means that the paper is still dry, however, our brush has to be dry as well. So I'm going to wipe off my brush. And it's fairly dry now. And using that same color, I'm just going to kind of dip the tip of the brush in so it's not full of watery pigment anymore. And I'm going to kind of scrape it across my paper. And because my brush is dry, on dry paper, it has a very different effect. So it's textured, you can see the texture of the paper coming through, and it creates these kind of wispy, sketchy lines. The next techniques are on wet, so you can guess it. It means that the paper is going to be wet. So we're going to clean off our brush so that our water is clear, and I'm going to paint my paper with lots of water. So this is just clear water painted inside of those boxes. And now we have an on wet paper to work with. And I'm going to start off to do a dry brush again, wipe off my brush so that it's nice and dry. Again, just put pigment on the tip so it's not soaking wet at all. And if I just touch it down onto this wet paper, I still have quite a bit of control because I don't have a lot of pigment on my brush, but it does start to kind of expand and create interesting kind of almost tie-dye effects. But the real tie-dye effect we're going to see with wet on wet. So we're going to put lots of water and pigment on our brush, and by simply touching it down, we get this nice starburst effect. And it really expands into that wet paper. Okay, so next what I've done is I've taken a picture of those 4 techniques that we just created using real watercolors, and I am going to insert another photo, add that to my canvas, and I'm going to put my watercolor ones on top, and then my other one that we added earlier, I'm going to put on the bottom. Just so that we can compare what we do digitally to what we've done with traditional watercolor mediums. So we have 2 layers that we're working on, so I'm going to rename them. So this one is going to be traditional watercolor, and then this one is going to be renamed digital watercolor. And because I don't want these layers to move, I'm actually going to swipe and lock them. And then I'm going to create a new layer above and call that watercolor. So this is the layer we're going to be working on. So we're going to try to mimic these techniques in Procreate and get very similar effects. So I'll change it to a different color so that we can have some comparison between the two. And there's a few different brushes that I want to point you guys to for using watercolor. Painting and artistic, you're going to find the most selection of brushes for this particular medium. So there is a brush that is called Watercolor. So why don't we click on that, and it's found under artistic. And we're going to make our brush size pretty large. And we'll reduce the opacity just a little bit. So I'm going to try this brush on the wet on dry technique. And looking at its effect, it actually mimics pretty closely to that watercolor wet on dry that we previously did. So that watercolor brush for a wet on dry technique does do a really nice job, in my opinion. For dry on dry, we need something that has a little bit more texture to it. So I mean, we have an oil paint brush, but it provides a little bit too much streaks and too much mimics oil paint, so we don't really want to use that. The damp brush or the dry brush has kind of similar results, so I'm actually going to use a dry brush that's found under painting. And if we go on our dry brush, you can see that it's similar. The only thing is it's not retaining kind of that watercolor paper that's under there. So I'm kind of doing my brush strokes in 2 different parts. So in order to get that kind of effect where the paper texture shows through, we might have to get a little bit creative. And actually on sketching, something like an oil pastel might have the right texture. So let's try that out instead. So here's oil pastel, and it creates that nice texture where you can see the watercolor through, but because it's pastel and it's dry, it doesn't have a smudgy effect. So there's 2 different things that we can do with this. We can go to our smudge tool and also select oil pastel. And then if you go over top of it with your smudge tool, I think you should be able to get more of a painterly effect. The other option is, if we go back to, sketching, oil pastel, and we duplicate our brush, if you go into your duplicated brush, you could play around with some of the properties of it in order to get it to be a little bit more like a dry on dry technique. So we could rename this brush, for example, dry on dry, so that we don't get it confused. And then it's already on wet mix. We could try it on glazed and just see kind of what the difference is there. So let's do that next. So on glazed, it actually is still pretty bold and harsh versus wet mix. That's actually softer. So we'll keep it on the wet mix that it's already at. But in here, there's certain things that we can kind of play around with. So dilution might be 1. So I'm going to dilute it a little bit. Now it's actually much softer, less harsh, but also I have to push quite hard in order to achieve those results. So I'm just going to move that back a little bit. Pull can be something else that we can play around with. I kind of like the results of playing with that. And then smudging it too might be something that you want to play around with. So I'll put it on smudge max. Just go back here. So playing around with a few of your brush properties can get you something pretty similar to that dry on dry technique. And now you have simply modified an existing brush, and you can move that existing brush into painting because it'll no longer act like a sketching brush. So move it into painting and you have a dry on dry brush to work with. So the next technique we're going to do, these ones are going to be a little bit trickier. They're the on wet techniques. So what we want to do is we do want to make sure that we're working with a brush that has a lot of smudge to it. So the damp brush is something that I kind of want to try out for this technique. And there might be a few things that we have to kind of play around with and kind of hone in on our technique in order to get it just right. So with the damp brush, let's just see what we can create with that. So we can create a really nice smudge effect with a damp brush. So if we go into our damp brush properties, so again, I'm going to duplicate it. And it is on wet mix. I'm going to reduce the pull of the brush a little bit. And if I actually just kind of reduce the opacity on this brush and touch it down, I actually do have pretty much that same effect of a dry on wet brush that I have from above. So that's kind of cool without doing anything. And then of course you could take your smudge and have it, again, if you want it on oil pastel, you could leave it on that because it creates that nice textured effect, or you could move it so that it actually matches the brush, so matches your damp brush, and then you could just basically make it nice and soft and smooth. So I think that's pretty good for our technique on dry on wet. So for wet on wet, what we're actually going to try out is our water brush, which is found under painting at the bottom. So if you click into water brush, it has this nice kind of quality to it that's probably going to match up pretty nicely for wet on wet. So I can just touch it down and it kind of does that expansion thing that wet on wet does. So really that brush is perfect for mimicking that wet on wet technique. So now that we've explored some of the techniques and the brushes that we can use to achieve them in Procreate, we're going to start to work on our portrait. So what I've gone ahead and done is a very rough sketch of this beautiful source image that can be found on Sketchy. And I'll just quickly show you guys the process in the time-lapse replay. So just blocking in the proportions using kind of geometric shapes, using really broken, sketchy lines, and a lot of hatching and cross-hatching in order to suggest where the shading is going to go. And this is pretty similar again to what my personal style would be when working on traditional watercolor. So while that's playing, I was just going to show you guys an example of the style of watercolor that I personally do and that we're going to kind of work on in today's lesson. So this is a handmade watercolor paper that has this nice texture to it, and this particular portrait is also found on the Sketchy app, and it's all done in watercolor as well as ink. And the ink pens that I use are these Micron pens, and I use that same travel watercolor set that I showed you guys before. So my style is pretty expressive. I like to have a lot of like kind of explosive, more abstract effects to it. And then I like to even keep the hatching and cross hatching in the portrait and adding those in ink later. So I'm going to show you guys how to achieve this kind of style, but using Procreate as your medium. So what we're going to start with is we're actually going to import a paper background. You don't have to do this step, but if you are looking to create, again, that kind of texture of natural watercolor, it might be something interesting to try out. So you can create your own background by taking a high-resolution photo of real watercolor paper, or there are tons of free downloads as well as paid downloads online where you could access paper backgrounds as well. So I'm going to go to Image, insert a photo, and I've saved two. I'm going to choose the one that has more texture to it, and I'm just going to make it so that it fills my canvas. And of course, I'm going to place it below my sketch. And so just with a couple steps like that, I've already created this kind of nice effect. The only thing I would say to be careful for is making sure that your image is high enough resolution that it doesn't look pixelated for your background, because then that's going to really give it away that it's digital and not kind of a traditional medium. So just going to rename this paper and sketch. So keeping our layers very nicely organized. I'm going to lock the paper layer because I don't want it to move. And then with the sketch layer, oftentimes when I'm working on a real watercolor portrait, I will try to do it lightly, try to do my outlines and my pencil sketching lightly, but anything that does get a little too dark, I'll just go over with an eraser and kind of erase those lines, especially if I'm using light colors, because once you lay down paint over top of with real watercolors, you can't erase your pencil lines underneath, so at least not easily. So I'm going to reduce the opacity on my sketch, and then we can bring out anything that we want bolded later on by using more of an ink technique. So now it's very, very faint. And again, I'm going to lock that layer and create a new layer that I'll just simply name Paint. And for this layer, we're going to do it above our sketch because I'm going to do it in a way that mimics traditional watercolor techniques. So the traditional way of doing things would be to prepare your paper, either stretching it or masking it off, and then you would of course lay down your sketch, a nice light sketch to work from, and then your next step would be adding paint, and then after that we would add our ink. You could technically, with these Micron pens, the reason why I use these ones is because they're archival ink and they're waterproof. So once they dry, you can actually lay down watercolor over top of them. So we could also have an ink layer, and that ink layer could be above or below our paint layer. And that would be the same for traditional watercolor. Okay, so for the paint layer, I'm going to use my source image as inspiration for the kind of the skin tones, and I'm going to change my palette to my skin palette. And I'm actually going to start with the damp brush that we were working on before, so I'll use the one that we modified. And I'm going to take kind of a middle tone of her skin, so something that is not the darkest and not the lightest, so somewhere in between. And on this layer, I'm just going to go around, and what I'm trying to do too is I'm trying to avoid, I should try to avoid spots that I want to keep white. One nice thing about working digitally is we don't have to worry about that as much as working with traditional watercolors, where you would want to mask off the white areas. But we are going to do a bit of masking in Procreate as well, so that's coming next. So just kind of looking at my source image for inspiration. Now I'm using a little bit more pressure to add in some of the darker areas. And you'll notice the darker areas are in this photo kind of on the outside of the face. The cheekbones can be very highlighted, the smile lines, the chin, the eyelids, and then also the corners of the temples. Just switching colors now. Just to add in more depth. And then what I might want to do, and I can still use this damp brush to do it, is with one of my darker tones, I'm going to go in and still on the damp brush, but I'm using it very small, and I'm going to go in and kind of add some of those details that I want to make sure don't disappear as I'm shading. Kind of do a little bit of a painted outline. Okay, just to kind of rough in where those areas are. The next thing I want to show you guys is how to do a masking technique. So with traditional watercolors again, you could use masking fluid. So here's one that I'm currently working on. The masking fluid is this blue fluid. It sometimes comes in pink, white, blue, different colors. This is just so it's very visible. And so what you would do in traditional watercolor is, in order to make sure that certain parts of your paper stay white, you're going to use masking fluid to cover those areas, and then that way you can paint freely even over top of the fluid, and what's underneath will stay white until you're ready to take the masking fluid off. You can even do that with the background too. So especially, you know, if you're starting out painting in watercolor and you want to really make sure that you don't get any spills on your background, you could actually paint in that whole area. So we're going to kind of use that traditional idea of masking fluid, but use it with some of the masking features of Procreate. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our selection tool, which looks like a ribbon, and we are going to make sure that it's on freehand. And I'm going to just draw just around the face. And I'm not going to worry about the hair too much right now. I'll just kind of go around the larger areas. Okay, just around the face. And then we're going to click on Add to Selection. And what we've done by clicking on Add to Selection is we have masked off everything other than the face. And the benefit of that is you can work with big, broad brush strokes and not get paint on any other part of your canvas. So we're kind of going to do that next. We're going to work a little bit more abstractly, almost the way that you might do with watercolor if you were doing like a wet-on-wet technique. You might, for example, mask off the areas around where you're going to lay down your water. So we'll pretend the face is kind of our water, and then we're going to just let things kind of explode and have fun with them in that area that we have available to us. So back onto our paintbrush, I'm going to choose water brush. And we're going to bring in some like maybe bold, fun colors. So some oranges. And with my water brush, I'm just going to let it kind of do its thing, kind of expand. Again, I'm paying attention to the areas that are darker right now. And this is definitely mimicking a wet on wet. So in this area, look at how I can go over with my brush really, really freely, and I don't have to worry about staying in the lines. What you will notice with the water brush is, like real watercolor, as you go over certain areas more and more, it will add pigment to those areas. So it does kind of mimic real life materials nicely in that way. Unlike watercolor, although you can get white watercolor, there's some purists out there who don't recommend using it. I still use white watercolor, but we can use it for this in any areas that start to get too dark. You can just change your color to white. What you'll notice though is in some areas it's actually, because of the brush that I'm using, it's actually kind of burnishing in those areas. So that's actually getting darker instead of lighter. So we might have to use a different brush in order to really get the effect we want. So even something like the round brush might have to go over certain sections with a different brush just in order to bring out those highlights again. Another thing that we can use in order to work more freely is our water brushes. So I'm actually going to reset this one because I made it really large. The blotch brush can create some cool kind of abstract effects. So reduce your opacity in order to make it look maybe a little bit more natural and realistic. And you can just kind of add a well-placed splash to certain areas. Again, you could change your eraser also to that same brush. So if you go under water and choose blotch and reduce the opacity on your eraser, it can kind of create similar interesting kind of watery effects. So I'll keep working on my skin tone and then we'll come back and explore some other brushes together. Okay, so I've been working on my watercolor techniques for a few minutes now, and I have now masked off in the similar way the hands. So everything around the hands are masked off. And I also wanted to point out to you guys a few other brushes that I've been using in order to create watercolor effects, especially for when I started to get into doing the fine lines and some of the outlines and darker shadowed areas of the portrait. I really like underwater. The water bleed, the wet sponge, the glaze, and the wash, as well as, of course, these water flicks and drips and blotches. So anything really under the water category is also really nice to use to create a watercolor technique. And I've been using the water bleed brush on a fairly small brush size in order to almost do kind of like outlines. So I've just done it here with the hand, done really quick kind of loose outlines in order to just give it the shadow that I need before I go in and start adding some of my washes. So I thought I would use a wet glaze to just kind of demonstrate that. So I'm going to take a color here for the hand. And on this finger, I'm just going to use a wet glaze to simply kind of lightly color this in. And on this side as well. And it creates that nice, soft kind of watercolor effect. I'm just going to go to a slightly lighter shade here. And like watercolor, it actually has the effect of if you go over it too many times, it gets darker, not lighter, which is kind of interesting. So if you want that challenge of working in a very similar way as watercolor, any of these water brushes are going to create that effect. Whereas, you know, a traditional kind of digital brush, you could easily go over top of it with another color to lighten it. You can't in this situation. So it really is acting. So you can see it happening here, right? Even though my color, I'll set it to white just to show you guys, even though my color is white, it's actually not creating a white effect over top. If anything, it's kind of burnishing it and making it a little bit darker. So that's something kind of interesting to try out. Again, using these blotches and flicks when masked off can create really interesting effects. So reduce your opacity, play around with the sizes of the blotches, and also just change up the different colors that you use. So adding highlights in some areas and then adding your dark tones in other areas. So it'll create kind of a more abstract kind of look if that's what you want to go for. So, and I like doing this with the masked off technique so that I can just kind of go wild with it and not worry about it leaking into other parts of the painting that I don't want to be covered in these blotches. So that's just quickly to show you guys a couple of the features of the water brushes. Okay, so most of the skin tone, including the hand, is complete using the same technique that we talked about before, masking off and then doing some kind of expressive brush strokes, as well as going in and doing fine details with some of the water brushes on a very small brush setting. So right now what I want to do is the hair. And to do that, we're going to go back to our water brushes. And I wanted to show you guys some kind of abstract techniques for creating hair. So we can just lay down with either the wet sponge or the wet glaze kind of a base color for the hair. Feel free to work freely with color, or you can work from the natural color of your photo. So just really, really quickly, I'm just putting down a wash, similar to what I would do with like a wet on wet kind of technique in traditional watercolor. And then for some of the areas where I want to do a little bit more detail, I'm just adjusting my brush size. And I just want to do a few wispy strokes, just to make it look a little bit natural to frame the face. And we're not going to worry too much about the highlights just yet. We'll come back to that in a second. So there, I've just kind of quickly framed the face with a few wispy brush strokes. And now we're going to get to what I think is the really fun part, which is using more of an abstract technique to create hair. So I'm going to use that blotch brush again on a fairly low opacity, and using my blotch brush on a pretty large size, I'm just going to stamp it. And for some reason, I like stamping with my finger better than with the Apple Pencil, so you can do whatever works for you. I'm kind of just going over and over again. And this brush is set to randomly kind of orient itself, so it's going to actually move in different directions depending on basically like where you put it down on the canvas. So grain behavior, it has a rolling movement, for example. If you want to make this blotch bigger, you can actually move the max size limits too. So if you wanted to do something really large in order to fill in some space, that's an option as well. So just something like this. And then what I also like to do is sometimes change my eraser tool to the same brush. So I'm going to go to water and have my eraser on blotch. And the effect that that can create is just to clean up edges, but make it a lot more natural looking. And again, just play around with the opacity of that brush. And go back and forth between your eraser and your brush, adjusting the sizes too. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a separate layer for hair so that I can really experiment on it and not worry about getting any splotches on my portrait. So yeah, you are somewhat limited to the brushes you have. So another option is to create your own brushes. If you guys are interested in seeing the full process for creating brushes from scratch, it's actually available in my other class called Portraits in Procreate Basics and Beyond. In that class, I go through step by step how to create a watercolor brush like these ones here. In this class, I'm going to show you simply kind of what the properties of some of my favorite brushes are, and then you can, of course, create your own. So one of my favorite brushes to use is this splatter brush here. And if I go into the brush properties under source, what you'll see in all my watercolor brushes is that the source, the shape source, is basically the entire brush. So the grain source is actually blank, and it's taken from the Pro library, and it's just basically a square that's completely white and completely blank. In order to create your watercolor brush, you can actually use real watercolor on paper, take a photo of it, so make an interesting shape, make interesting textures, take a photo of it, and then you're going to insert your photo, grab that photo from your photo library, and then invert it. And the invert step is really important so that you lose the bounding box that's around it. And so all of these brushes were created by creating real watercolor paints and then creating a new brush, adding the shape source to the library, inverting the shape, and then keeping the grain source. You'll notice they all have a grain source of nothing, just a blank box. That's because the texture of these brushes are actually within the shape source itself. And I use these brushes more as stamps rather than brushes themselves. So to show you guys an idea of how to use it, I'm going to go to this splatter one here. And if you want to use the stock brush, you'll find something very similar under watercolor. You'll find water flicks and also these other mad flicks, I think they're called, mad splashes. So you can use these as well. And then the next step after using those is to create your own brushes. So this one I like for basically creating kind of random interesting looking watercolor splashes, similar to the effects you would get in real life if you took your watercolor brush and you soaked it in water with paint on it and flicked it at the canvas. So it would create something very, very similar to this. So it does again mimic that real life technique of working with watercolor. The other brush that I really like is this one here because it has lots of interesting textures to it. And I'm actually just going to change it to maybe like a lighter gray because it's going to add some highlights for me. So using this brush again, kind of like a stamp. So that's with gray, and then I'm going to go over with black in order to create more texture. Play around with size, right? That was obviously too big. And a lot of it is experimentation. So putting something down and experimenting with how that looks on your canvas. Again, changing your eraser tool to one of the water brushes also can really help to create interesting effects and kind of clean up some areas. And again, I would recommend doing this on a separate hair layer or whatever you want to name your layer. That way you're not interfering with the kind of the detail that you've already put down on the portrait. So just kind of playing around with doing something that looks really natural. And that's kind of, it looks easier than it actually is, I think, because I think that, it's easy enough to stamp and create these kind of watery, painterly effects, but to have it look natural and not digital is key. So basically playing around with size, playing around with the orientation of the brush, using as many different varied brushes as you possibly can, and how you layer them and what choices you make in the placement of the brush will all contribute to making it look more natural rather than kind of having that repeated kind of digital look, unless of course that's what you're going for. So just have fun with it. The more that you play around with the brushes and their placement, the better you will get at being able to create something that's kind of interesting and creates that nice painterly effect that you would find in watercolor painting. The next step to our watercolor technique will be inking. And this is of course something optional, but watercolor and ink do go really nicely together and they can create some interesting effects together. And for the most part, in traditional watercolor, people may not use inks. However, in more contemporary versions of watercolor painting, it's become quite popular. And people even use gel pens, and you can add metallics through your inking as well, or use a white gel pen or a white ink pen in order to create kind of interesting highlighted effects. So we're going to work with mostly black and white in order to create kind of the finishing touches to our portrait. So Procreate already has really nice ink brushes. So if you go under inking and calligraphy, you will find a whole set of beautiful brushes to work with. I'm going to go under inking, and I'm going to start with using my fine tip, which is one of the smallest brushes that you can use. It's going to mimic, again, using something like this micron pen that come in, this one's actually a size 1, but they come in like 005s and really, really small sizes. So this is going to mimic that fine tip detail of a pen like this. So we're going to have our color on black to start with, and I'm going to change to my ink layer. And this is where I'm going to kind of add some of my hatching back in. And again, this is how I work, but you need to find what style kind of works for you. If hatching isn't what you want to do, you can try using your ink techniques in a different way. So I'm just going to do a little cross hatching in some of these areas that are darker, and a little bit of a hatching here. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to kind of match the contours of the face, and I'm going in some of the darkest areas just to, you know, make them a little bit more three-dimensional, make them stand out a little bit more and have some texture too. I like to do some fine inking, usually in the corners of the eyes and beside the nose. I find that working quickly with your pencil will actually give you better results than if you painstakingly try to do it slow. They might not be perfect lines, but that's okay. They're expressive and they will have a nice quality when zoomed out, when you're looking at it at kind of a natural distance. So again, this is what I would do with my traditional watercolors, just to add some more finishing details to it. Also gives you a bit more control than with your paintbrush. So if there's anything that you want to go in and kind of touch up, such as maybe like adding some nicely placed eyelashes, because you have that really fine control with an ink pen, you can do that. Eyebrows are another area. With traditional watercolor, one of the worries is sometimes overworking your canvas because it can be kind of an unforgiving medium. So working in Procreate to create similar effects is a little bit more forgiving in some ways. Because you've done things on different layers, if you feel that you've overworked something, you could delete that layer and try something new. So that's just to show you guys a little bit of hatching and cross-hatching. The other way that I like to use ink is in more expressive ways. So this is a really subtle technique. If you want to do something bolder and more abstract, you might want to use something like a studio pen. And for this, I'm going to do something a little bit more abstract. So I'm using really wispy, quick lines to, you could see, like quickly outline the face. I also chose to leave certain aspects of my picture not that filled in, like the earrings. Depends what kind of artist you are. I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm a lazy artist that, like, sometimes I like the challenge of trying to recreate something really realistically, and then other times I just like suggesting those areas. So what I'm doing here is that kind of suggestive kind of technique. Same with the hair. I can just, you know, with a few well-placed, again, I'm using really fluid movements with a few well-placed lines. I can create kind of interesting effects. Sometimes you need to know when to stop, so you could do this on a different layer, especially if you're just starting out and this is something you're maybe not used to. I'm going to do it also for my clothing, which was kind of in the background here. There we go. And even on the hands themselves, just a few outlines. That one's a little bit too bold for me. On the ring, a few outlines, a few little squiggly kind of abstract lines you can add to it too, can create kind of movement and different effects depending on what you want. So that's how I would use ink in a bolder kind of way. And then the next thing that I want to show you is how to use ink to highlight certain areas. So we're going to change our brush color to white. And I'm actually going to create a new layer. I'll just call it ink highlights. You could call it white ink, whatever you want to do. I'm going to go back to something like a fine tip, but why don't we experiment with a few other things, why not, and try the ink bleed, which has kind of a nice natural kind of effect to it, as if your ink is soaking into your paper and bleeding out a little bit. So we're going to use that one in order to create some highlights in the hair. I'm going to keep my brush pretty small. And I'm going to look at my source image just to kind of get a sense of the natural movement of the hair and where these highlights might be placed. And I'm just using right now some really fine, light, curved lines, and I'm trying to curve them in the same direction that I'm kind of looking at my source image on. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm a big advocate for suggesting where things are, so using your source picture as inspiration, but not trying to necessarily recreate that photograph. I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger and bolder, so in some spots I can create bolder highlights. I've also been zooming in and out. If you guys notice, I've zoomed right in to see fine details, and then I like to zoom in and out quite a bit when working, because I find that if you're always pixel peeping, you're up really close to your canvas, you might miss something when you're kind of looking back and forth between your source photo and your picture. And again, that's another tip I want to offer too, is constantly observing. So looking at your source, looking at your image, and back and forth and back and forth. If you're too tunnel visioned on your drawing, sometimes you're going to miss certain aspects of your source image that might help to inspire you. I'm not a fan of maybe some of these here. So anything that you don't like, you could just take your brush on a low opacity and blend out the edges. I'm also going to use the highlighting brush to highlight, and I've already done this a little bit with paint, but highlight the eyelashes here. Any little glows that you see in your picture that you want to stand out. And again, this is something that I do with traditional watercolor all the time. I love adding white gel pen to my watercolor paintings. I'm just going to do a little hatching, cross-hatching, especially in the really bold highlighted parts of the face. Texture on lips too can be something that you might want to add with your pen tool. If you want kind of the outline to glow in certain areas, you could also highlight that. Try highlighting tops of the lips. Just anything that you really want it to kind of stand out, sparkle, glow. Even the teeth, there's certain spots on the teeth that are a little bit brighter. So I'm just going to add a little bit of a highlight there. Can make it look a little natural. Fingernails. One of my favorite parts of doing any portrait in Procreate is kind of this last finishing touch part, because I just feel like you can see the picture coming together, and it's these little details that you add that make such a huge difference in the outcome of your portrait. I'm going to highlight a little bit on this ring, anything that sparkles. And I'm not necessarily going for realism, obviously, with some of these bold brushes in here, but just something that suggests the jewelry in the picture. Just went back to my black ink a little bit here. Just decided I wanted to add some more shadow into this. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we are going to lay down a little bit of a wash for her shirt, because I'm feeling it's a little bit blank right now. And here's another advantage of using Procreate, is that we don't actually have to painstakingly go around our portrait, but we can just choose to put it on a layer that's underneath. So I'm going to rename this wash. And I'm going to use my trusty freehand selection tool in order to mask out just the area that I want painted. And I'm going to add that to selection. And then what I want to do is I want to use some of my watercolor brushes in order just to add some painterly kind of effects in here. So I'll start with this brush that I created that's kind of just like a flat brush stamp effect. Maybe we can add some drips, which would be cool. We could also add some splatters. Just darken some areas up a little. And then uncheck it, and anything that didn't get covered up, I could just go in with any brush and kind of darken up those areas. And last but not least, I'm going to take my eraser brush on another kind of organic watercolor brush that I made, and I'm going to make it really big. Opacity is about halfway, and I'm just going to add a little bit of a highlighting effect into it so it's not so dark. And you can kind of have fun with that, play around with all of those brushes. You could make your own watercolor brushes, play around with how you can use ink in an interesting and abstract way, and have fun. Well guys, that concludes today's lesson. Thank you so much for drawing with me today.